Please pray with me. Almighty God, thank you so much for gathering us here in this place together this morning. As we prepare now to hear your word proclaimed, we ask that your Spirit move in us, move in our hearts and move in our minds, and bring new light and new life. Help us to bring new light and new life to the world. And now, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. So if you'll remember from Shauna's sermon last week, she talked about how the story of the resurrection of this miracle begins being told in small pieces. And what we have at the beginning here is that when Mary first tells the story, it's not believed. The disciples don't believe it. And so what they do is they go and they're so confused and they're so scared, and they go and they gather together in the place where they've been meeting. And they shut the doors in the gathering dark of evening, and they lock them. They're afraid. You see, they're afraid of the authorities. They're afraid of what's happened. It's only been 3 days since Jesus was killed, and he wasn't just killed. He was killed by the most serious and horrible form of punishment. And it wasn't just execution. Crucifixion was reserved by the Romans for insurgents, for political execution. Dare I say it, for terrorists. Jesus was executed as an insurgent, and these were his followers gathered who didn't know what to do or what to expect or who would be next. And Mary tells them this story of how the tomb is empty. And they don't believe it. They go and they hide and they close the doors amid the gathering dark. But in the midst of that locked door, Jesus himself comes. The door doesn't unlock. He doesn't walk through the door. He just appears in the midst of them and says, "Look at my hands. Look at my side. It's me. I'm alive." And then he says, "Go. Go and take this word to the world." But Thomas isn't there. And Thomas doesn't believe. Now, I think, honestly, myself, that we give Thomas a bad rap. I've heard doubting Thomas, don't be a doubting Thomas, enough times in my life. But I think, as the story progresses, it's a week later, and the disciples, Thomas and the ones who were there the first time Jesus appeared, are still in that same room. Well, they're still in a room. They assume it's the same room with the door locked, afraid, at the gathering dark. And I think we give Thomas a bad rap because he's not necessarily saying, "I don't believe because I'm stubborn." I think he looks around at the other disciples and sees that they've all said, "We've seen the resurrected Jesus." But they're all still sitting in the same room with the door locked. And he says, "Why should I believe? You say you believe, but you're not doing it. You're still sitting in the same room with the door locked." And then Jesus comes in their midst again and says, "Peace be with you." I mean, Jesus is a lot more patient than I am. Jesus probably didn't say it that way, but that's how I would think. I mean, thank God that God is more patient than I am. But he says, "Peace be with you," and then he goes directly to Thomas, who we for centuries, for millennia, have called doubting Thomas. And he says, "Thomas, put your hands in my side. Touch my wounds. It's me." What I find interesting is that John never says Thomas touches the wounds. John never says that Thomas actually grabs Jesus' hands. Thomas's answer is immediate: "My Lord and my God." Because the crucial point isn't whether or not he touched Jesus, it's that he believed. And then Jesus says, "You have believed because you have seen. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And definitely that's a message from the writer of the gospel to us. And in his time, that's a message to a community that was very conflicted and very confused about how to believe in this resurrection that they hadn't actually been there for. But I think there in that room, Jesus is kind of saying, "Thomas, you got the right answer. Blessed are you who have seen and believed. And it's saying it on some level, everybody else here in this room already saw it and said they believed, but they didn't really do it. They all gathered together in this darkness, amid the gathering of evening, amid the gathering of the darkness. I truly believe that we can all relate to this. I actually have a story from yesterday where I was in the midst of trying to hem and haw and say, oh, I don't know if I want to try and be a pastor, I want to try and be a chaplain, I'm so confused, and God has been telling me one thing for so long, and I just wish that God would take the stones and make the path right in front of me so I knew exactly where to step. And my wife Lauren turns to me and she says, Peter, God has built a car around you, put you in the driver's seat, buckled you in, filled up the gas tank, put a GPS with exactly where you're going on the dashboard, and turned the key. And you're sitting there with your foot on the gas pedal trying to decide whether to push it down. We can all relate to this story, right? Jesus comes in our midst and tells us where to go. But we want a better sign, we want a different signal, and we struggle. We struggle to make that choice, to believe, to move the bar from the door, to move outside of the room. The darkness is always out there. Death is always at the door. Fear is always at the door. Christ didn't take away death or fear. Christ abolished the power of sin and fear, of death. And so we sit in the darkness, afraid, wondering what will happen. How often have we done this? I'm new to this community. I'm just learning it. I don't know. I know the stories of Norwood Park and of St. Andrews. But I can imagine there were many times in meetings and in worship where it felt like being in the dark with the gathering gloom. How good is the news that Christ came into that darkness, into that gathering gloom, and said, peace be with you. I send you. The Father has sent me, I send you. And now here we are in this space, in this beautiful space with light, windows that are painted in artwork, and the community gathered together in a new and terrifying sometimes and wonderful journey, all together here in this space. Christ finds us amid the gathering gloom, the dark. It's a little bit like Wendell Berry's poem, The Mad Farmer Liberation Front, Manifesto, where he talks about the things that we're scripted to do in our culture, the ways, in a sense, that we as people, as individuals, as communities, as Christians, just as people of this country and of this world, gather together and lock the doors and do what we're supposed to and fear the gathering death and the gathering gloom. Mary says, plant sequoias. Tell the world that you have invested in the 2 inches of humus on the ground that will accumulate over 1,000 years. I'm paraphrasing because I can't find the line in the poem, to be honest. He says, I mean, I kind of just wanted to read Wendell Berry's poem and let that be the sermon this morning. But this quote on the screen was practice resurrection. Berry says, practice resurrection by investing in the things that you'll never live to see the result of. Sequoias, the trees that are largest, some of the largest in the world, that we never ever live to see the growth of. That this is how we practice resurrection. The good news this morning is that Christ broke the power of sin and death. The challenge to us is that the gathering gloom is still outside our doors. We have that good news. We have that resurrection to practice. We have work still to do here at Friendship Presbyterian Church. We have done, I'm new to this community. You as a community have done new and radical and wonderful things. And there's work still to do. And this beautiful liturgy that Kathy put together for us today, all of the words and the songs that we've sung, the challenge that we live those words and not just say them and not just sing them. That we live those words when we leave this space. That we don't lock the doors of our hearts even while we open the doors of the space. We take the resurrected Christ into the world and we say, maybe it's as simple as we say, Christ is risen, even though Christ is risen. Even though our culture has decided that Easter is over. Because we know that you can't contain that resurrection in one Sunday, in one day. We know that. Let's practice resurrection today. Let's go out into the world, go out into our lives of faith and our lives of work, our families, our communities, and practice resurrection. Thanks be to God.